The Vikings. They came, they saw, and they conquered. And then they started to speak French. Now, most of you who watch this channel will know that the term Norman is really a shortening of the term Northman or Nordmani if we're using the original form of the word, which relates to men from the north, so Scandinavians or Vikings, whatever you want to call them. But of course, the Normans that invaded England in 1066 were a very different kind of man to the ones that we normally associate with the Vikings. So in this video, I want to look at how did these Vikings, let's say these Scandinavians, become the Normans that we sort of associate with the word today, and that's what I want to explore today. I actually want to mention the video's sponsor, who I've actually been using their videos to learn about this topic about the Normans, and the sponsor is Magellan TV. Now, this is a new documentary type of streaming service. You pay for a membership and you can actually get a free trial, and there is actually also an exclusive offer for watchers of my channel, which I'll talk about at the end here. But I've actually been watching this series which just came out about the Normans to learn about this period. They actually have a really big range of different topics, so not just about the Normans, they have lots of things about history, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, into the more modern period, the Middle Ages, and just this one about the Normans, as well as things about science and space and nature. Honestly, anything that you really want to watch a documentary about, they will have on Magellan TV. They have an awful lot of things, so I'm really glad that they've agreed to sponsor this video today. If you go to the description below, you can find this as well and just click on the link. But with this code, with magellantv.com/historywithhilbert, you can get 1 month free trial for this service, and you can watch all of these documentaries on there. So I'd highly recommend you do that. It would really help me out if you did. And I think it's a great service. So definitely check out Magellan TV, and big thank you for sponsoring this video on the Normans. The Viking Age in Western Europe started at the end of the 8th century. In Eastern Europe, it probably started a bit earlier. Actually, remind me to make a video about that in the comments below. I've read something very interesting. But that essentially meant that there were these armed bands of men from Scandinavia and possibly from other places too, going about and raiding monasteries and later towns and cities as well around the coastlines of Western Europe. Now, one of the places that they did this in was in Frisia as well. And the Franks, you know, they weren't too pleased about this because it was part of their empire and they were losing money there. So what they came up with was this idea to actually give parts of Frisia to various Danish warlords in the hope that they would then protect that area, those towns, especially Dorestad, the famous trading centre, from other Viking Age attackers. If you're curious where Frisia is today, it's actually a certain country. It's really low, associated with the colour orange, lots of windmills, and it has a national anthem that is apparently a lot of you know. You know what's coming next. Okay, so an important note to make about these is that the official term for what was going on in Frisia was that this was a benefice, because these Danish warlords were beneficiaries of the land. They essentially became vassals of the Frankish emperor. So this wasn't becoming an independent little state for them. Sure, they might have run it that way, but they were essentially the bondsmen of the Frankish emperor at the time. And when they died, they would have the land taken off them again. It wouldn't go over to their son. Sometimes they'd then give it to another warlord. So for example, after Hrólfr dies, Hrólfr of Dorestad was there for a long time, it got given to a certain Godfrid, who they later killed because he was really quite bad at doing his job. But that is an important distinction to make, especially when I'm about to talk about Normandy, where the situation was quite different, but it's clearly inspired by what the Frankish rulers were already doing in Frisia at the time. So it's important to note that this area of Frisia, they'd been doing this system with Frankish, Danish warlords and installing them as beneficiaries, because actually the various Viking groups had been coming and attacking the Frankish heartland as well. So Paris is besieged in 845 and at numerous other times, and the Vikings really, they made use of the rivers, and they would camp out around the mouth of the Loire and the Seine, and then they would use the rivers to penetrate deep inland and then to raid monasteries and get all kinds of booty there. And the Franks were none too pleased. Their armies often refused to fight against the Danes, and they had real trouble holding them back, especially when they were at the mouths of these rivers and using it as a launch pad to attack the countryside. And actually they were using these river mouths as such bases that they actually had some settlements around there already before the Duchy of Normandy became officially theirs, so to speak. There were already Norse settlements there from which they were attacking the heartland of the Frankish Empire. Now in 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple decided to try a new approach with which to deal with the Vikings that were constantly attacking him. And actually, after having defeated a certain Viking chieftain called Rollo, which is the French version of the Old Norse name Hrólfr, he decided to treat with him and instead to grant him an area of land in return for his loyalty and the promise that he would stop any other Viking attackers coming down the great rivers to attacking places like Chartres, which he'd been attacking, and Paris as well. And this was ratified, we know from about this from Dodo of Cointin later on. It's called the Treaty of Clair-sur-Epte, and this was the treaty signed in probably around 911, which gave this ruler Rollo, this Hrólfr, gave him the land around the area that's now Normandy. Specifically, these were the pagis, which was the word used at the time. I believe it's related to the French word pays, like pas de Calais, which is obviously a region around Calais. And these regions that were granted to Rollo and his followers were the Caux de Évrançon, Roumois, and Talou originally. But then in 924, King Radolf, the successor of Charles, or one of his successors, decided to give more land to the Normans that they'd done well. They were holding the line against the further Viking invaders and the Viking attackers. And so he also gave the Bassin region and up to a certain river to the Normans as well. And this region had actually already been settled a little time before by Vikings, by Danes who came over from England and had decided to settle there. Now we also get in 933 that more land was actually given to the successor of Rollo, to his son William Longsword, and this was the land of Avranchin and Cotentin. The Cotentin is the peninsula which juts out. I'll show you on the map in just a second, and this is really important here, is that Cotentin was pretty much only settled by Norwegians, by Norsemen coming over, and this was a really solidly Scandinavian colony, rather than that they came in and that they were then with the local population, because of course beforehand there were some Viking settlements, there were some Scandinavian settlements around the mouths of the rivers, but for the rest it was all just the Gallo-Romance population of the people who had been there, before and during the Roman time. Obviously the leading officials were Franks, which had been a Germanic tribe, but the vast amount of people in the countryside probably still spoke some form of a kind of Latin language that obviously later became French as we know it today. So if we look on the map here, this is kind of the evolution that we see. This is the whole area that came under Norman control by around 933. And we see here, this is the main area. Now, this area was obviously largely settled then by these Gallo-Romance peoples, but the Cotentin Peninsula, I've just shaded in there, this was largely settled by these Norsemen. And so we see a difference in the nomenclature, in the toponymy, and the culture that we see in these various parts of Normandy. This also explains some of the place names we see around the Cotentin Peninsula. One of the most sort of crucially Viking ones that we can think of is Le Tangland, which seems very strange to say in French because of course this quite clearly comes from the Thing, which was the assembly for Scandinavians and for other Germanic peoples that we see around the North Sea area. We also have other names that we might find and that we can trace back to Norse origins like Haga, Sarnes and Helganes. All of these are places we might expect to see in Norway or Denmark, but in fact we see them here on the north coast of France because of Normandy. But again, this is around that very solid, densely packed Scandinavian settlement of the Cotentin Peninsula, of these Norse comers that were there. For the rest of Normandy, there were definitely settlers that came, but these were then coming and they were intermingling with the rest of the population. So first of all, they would have brought wives from Denmark, from Norway, wherever they were coming from. Probably a lot of them were coming over from England, some might have come over from Ireland as well. It was probably quite a big mixture that came, some from the Northern Isles and other places where Scandinavians were trading and living and fighting and raiding. But of course soon they would run out of Scandinavians, or not even necessarily run out of Scandinavians to marry, but if you start living next to people you might start fancying them and start having kids with them, and then you start to intermingle and assimilate into the local culture. So this is something that we see if I make this very simple diagram here, that let's say you have a Norse man and a Norse woman come, and then they have a child, and okay, so that child speaks Old Norse in the home and dresses in a certain way that the parents do. But let's say he then goes out and he gets married to a Frankish woman, then their child would of course have influences from both the Frankish side of the father, the Frankish side from the mother, and the Norse side from the father. And then if they go out and get with a Frankish person as well, then you can see that clearly the influence is there. If you've got a small number of Danes, it doesn't take long before everyone is, and this is just genetically Frankish. Culture, of course, doesn't work along such rigid lines, and so it's very easy for such a small population in the larger area of Normandy to become assimilated. Now, this is a process that we can see happening even just by looking at the names of the rulers of Normandy. The first ones, obviously, Hrólfr, Rollo is the Frankish version. The French version of that is an Old Norse name. Now, his son William is already ambiguous. That would be Guillaume for French, but obviously you've got Vilhjálmur if you want to turn that into an Old Norse name. But then his son Richard, that's not a particularly Old Norse name, and he also has a son called Richard, and then you get another William down the line. So you can see that the naming even of the rulers of the dynasty, that they become more Frankified as time goes on, and this is something we can expect to see in the general population, and indeed that we do see. Now, what's interesting is that Rollo's wife was actually the daughter of quite a famous count in the area, a Frankish count, and she was therefore also a Frank. So that's then already the second ruler. William Longsword is half Frankish genetically, and probably culturally took quite a lot from that. And actually that's something we can infer, because in 927, just when he was into his reign, there was actually a rebellion against him, because, well, they thought he was becoming too Frankified and wasn't Norse enough.
I don't understand, because my
Old Norse
is very bad.
William managed to put down the rebellion and so continued to rule and continued the more Frankified direction of the ruling house over Normandy. He also got more lands, the aforementioned Avranchamp and Cotentin Peninsula, which had actually belonged to the Bretons, a very independent-minded people that he came into conflict with, because he was also loyal to the Frankish king at the time, which also brought him into conflict with Arnulf, who was a very famous, very powerful Duke of Flanders, and he actually had him assassinated with the death of the previous ruler of Normandy, with the death of William Longsword. He left his 10-year-old son Richard I, who would become the first actually named Duke of Normandy. Now, it's not sure whether this actually refers to any change in his legal standing with the King of France, or whether this was just a reference to his prestige in battle. And I was very tempted to sort of turn this whole video into a video about Richard, but I think I'm going to make a separate video about him, because he's a real badass. He really cements the kind of Norman this idea that the Normans were unbeatable in battle, because he goes up against a lot of the enemies of his father, against Arnulf, against the French king, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he's able to defeat them all essentially, but with help from men from Scandinavia. So while they were becoming increasingly Frankified, they still had those ties to men across the sea, to the Scandinavians, and he receives help from King Harold. This is Harold Bluetooth in Denmark. He sends help down to him from Denmark, so there's clearly still an idea that they had come from across the sea, even though they were now 3 generations into living in Francia. Now, Rollo had agreed to become a Christian. William Longsword was a Christian too, and so was Richard. But during Richard's early reign, when he was just a minor, so during the Regency, there was some sort of relapse back to paganism in the area, and we do get some indications of cultic sites throughout Normandy. But we do also see on his coinage that clearly this is a Christian motif. You can see there the cross there. You can see Ricardus, which is Richard, and I think Rotomic Kivit, which will be Kivit, I think will be from town, so I think that'll be Rouen, where this coin was struck. So we can clearly see Christian imagery there, and being more involved with the surrounding Frankish Empire, despite this return to paganism by some in the area of Normandy, and despite his fighting against the Franks. Duke Richard did actually combat this and was probably a pious Christian himself. He brought men from the Rhineland, clerical men, clergymen from the Rhineland in, and he also gave a lot of land back to the church that had been taken from them and gave new lands to them and founded lots of monasteries within Normandy. So he is, remembered with quite a good rap by the church in this area. He also helped to place, to keep the king on the throne and also to expand or even introduce entirely the feudal system. So really, this goes from being a Norse colony at that point to being really part of the rest of continental mainland Europe, thanks to his efforts at the time. But even so, we can still see the Scandinavian heritage. A lot of the Norman knights, they obviously weren't able to trace their lineages back to these Carolingian figures as those in the surrounding territory were. So they were often very poor, but very good fighters. And I think this is where they get their reputation from, the Normans, for being these excellent fighters, as I'm going to talk about in future videos as well. So thank you very much for watching this one. This one has obviously been about the Normans and about how the Scandinavians, or these Viking figures that came to pillage and plunder in Francia, settled down. They were given this area of land that was then named after them, and then they started to take on part of the local culture and become Francified until, by the reign of Richard, I'd say he's clearly a Norman rather than a Scandinavian. And obviously by 1066, they were no longer speaking Old Norse at all. They were speaking Norman French, which I might actually make a video about as well, because that is actually the language which influenced Old English when it came over with the Normans, and so it's really quite an interesting one. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this one. Please do check out Magellan TV, it would help me out, and they have some great stuff on there. And stay tuned for more videos that I have coming. Give me a subscribble if you're new and you enjoyed it, and a thumbs up as well, and any comments, any questions you have in the comment section below. And I'll see you all again very soon. Hope everyone has a cracking day.